Welcome to this latest Forage Shrubs webinar. I'm Nick Poltridge from Mallee Sustainable Farming, and we're joined today by Dr Stuart Collard. Stuart currently works as an ecologist with the South Australian Government, but has worked previously on biodiversity and agricultural landscapes, including in forage shrub plantings. And that's our focus today. This talk is one of several events being run in our CMA-funded Forage Shrubs project. We're running a few of them online, Stuart, because a lot of our farmers are dispersed across the Mallee, and we know they can't get to all our face-to-face events. Just before we begin, we want to acknowledge the support of the Mallee Catchment Authority in this work, with funding from the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. And we also need a disclaimer: the information we provide in these webinars is of a general nature, so you do need to get your own advice tailored to your specific situation rather than rely wholly on what we say. I gather the talk goes for about 20 minutes. Thank you, Stuart. Feel free to make a start.
Very good. Thank you very much for the introduction, Nick. And hello, everybody out there. I hope you're having a good season. Nick has asked me to present today on some of the work that I did many years ago now on saltbush plantings and fodder shrub plantings or forage shrub plantings in the South Australian Murray Mallee. It was a fantastic time I spent looking around areas in the SA Murray Mallee. And yeah, I'm really glad that I've got the opportunity to share the results of that work with you today.
Well, we're really happy to have you, Stuart, because we just know that this is one of the co-benefits of forage shrubs, so some influence on biodiversity, and it's just a great little value add for our project to have you. Anyway, I shouldn't interrupt. Carry on.
Fantastic. So yeah, as Nick mentioned earlier, I trained as a terrestrial ecologist many moons ago now, and I've worked across Southeast Australia on agroecosystem services throughout southern Queensland, New South Wales, and South Australia. Currently based in Adelaide, South Australia, working for a landscape board similar to your catchment management authorities.
Yep.
And it's an urban or metropolitan based landscape board called Green Adelaide. And I've been working there for a couple of years now.
Yep.
I've always had a real interest, both professional and personal, in using ecological indicators to measure ecosystem condition, and in particular birds. So I've always had a real interest in birding, and also how can we use birds as indicators of broader ecosystem condition. And I was lucky enough to be able to incorporate that passion and interest into some of the work that I did when I was at Rural Solutions here in South Australia, whilst also working with the Environment Department at the time, Department of Water, Land and Biodiversity Conservation. And we had some funding through the Future Farm Industries CRC to look at forage shrubs and the biodiversity values associated with forage shrubs. So this will form the basis of my presentation today, and also resulted in a number of published papers in collaboration with a number of co-authors on the biodiversity values of saltbush plantings.
Fantastic. So
some of the background, and bear in mind that this is background that I think is still very relevant. At the time, this was the background information that we sought to inform this research. However, some of the information in here is still very, very relevant. So at the time, revegetation in farming landscapes was falling very short of some of the regional targets that had been put in place for South Australia. There was a need to improve the structure and function of ecosystems at local and landscape scales. Obviously, that depends on what sort of landscape you're in. However, in many landscapes, there is a lack of, if you're looking at it from a biodiversity perspective at least, there's a lack of structure and diversity in the landscape to be able to accommodate some of these animals that perhaps are beneficial for that landscape and for production in that landscape. So the matrix, as it's called in ecological circles, is all of that land that sits outside of the native or remnant vegetation in a landscape. And clearly, the value of that matrix habitat is really critical for a whole bunch of critters that try and find their homes in that landscape.
Yeah.
And woody perennial plantings address that issue, as well as other or multiple other NRM issues, including, of course, production values. So these systems are brought into a landscape. Often, in this instance, saltbush plantings or Atriplex nummularia is not native to some of these areas and has been introduced into the system and into the landscape. And these types of systems are called novel systems. And those novel systems, even though they're not necessarily locally indigenous, can have significant benefits for that landscape, both in terms of production, but also in terms of ecological function. And increasingly, the benefits to a changing climate are recognised. Probably since I was looking at this area and researching forage shrubs, the interest in agricultural landscapes around carbon and biodiversity markets has increased significantly. And it's undoubted that these fodder shrubs can provide both biodiversity benefits and carbon benefits within a landscape. I'll talk a little bit later just about how those benefits might be able to be quantified. Just to recap, the results that I'll present today were really framed around the question, how does biodiversity use planted woody perennial vegetation in South Australia? This just puts things into a little bit of context around the historical nature of some of these landscapes, and certainly in the mallee systems, you'd replace the woodland or forest with a mallee sort of system that would have been there originally prior to clearance. That's been the land use in that area has been intensified, often to the point where there's a crop grown, and then oftentimes the reverse of that process. So restoration has been happening in some of these landscapes. And this diagram just shows some of the pathways to woody establishment of woody vegetation back into these landscapes. And one of those areas of interest is woody shrub plantings for forage. And in this case, the focus was on monocultural plantings of old man saltbush or Atriplex nummularia. Hopefully this isn't too overwhelming, but there's been a lot of research done, both on the production values and the biodiversity values of these planted landscape components. This list of references essentially summarises the recent publications or recent research that's been done on these plantings across Australia. So there's different groups have been looking at this, and I'll just run through some of the work that I've done. So those publications in the middle that will form the basis of my presentation of research findings today. But it's also important to note that others have followed on or have worked on this prior to and after the work that I did with some of my colleagues back in 2009 to 2011. So what did we do out in this landscape? Really interesting part of the world to work. The research was focused around around Lameroo and Pinaroo in the eastern part of South Australia, and we picked out old man saltbush plantings in those different areas. We tried to select sites that were similar in terms of their age and in terms of their position in the landscape. And we ended up picking 5 sites in 3 different treatments. The treatments were planted saltbush, pasture, and remnant. And bear in mind, some of those pasture areas had been previously cropped. That led to a total sampling site size of 15 sites, so 5 saltbush, 5 pasture, and 5 remnant vegetation. We really wanted to look at what the differences were between those different treatment types, with a focus on the planted saltbush, just to compare their value in terms of biodiversity across those 3 treatment types. And we undertook some vegetation assessments in there, so using the bushland condition monitoring method, which measures a whole range of different indicators, but we focused on things like plant species composition, so what types of plants were in there and how many of them there were, as well as habitat complexity. So what is the structure of that vegetation? Is there ground cover? Is there shrub cover? Is there canopy cover in the case of the remnant vegetation? I always find it difficult to leave out birds from the activities that I undertake, and so we included bird surveys using the recognised 2 hectare 20-minute bird survey method as used by BirdLife Australia, and we looked at the community composition, abundance, and behaviour of each of those, or of the bird assemblages that we're using those 3 different land use types. We also did a very preliminary assessment of the invertebrates that were using these areas. And so we set up things called sticky traps in each of the treatments with 3 sites only. This was an attempt to look at some of the beneficial insects and also the pest insects that might have been using those different systems. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So this is just an example of the treatment types. On the left of screen is the pasture treatment, in the middle is the saltbush, and on the right-hand side is the mallee treatment, or the remnant vegetation treatment. They're the 3 types of systems that we compared in the landscape. We found some really interesting results. At certain times of the year, we had influxes of things like orange chats. So that's what you can see on your screen, a male and a female orange chat using the saltbush. We found other interesting things in the adjacent remnant vegetation like chestnut quail thrush. We found that in the saltbush plantings, there was evidence of nesting of some of these birds. So the chats in particular use these saltbush systems preferentially to establish nesting sites. So we found white-fronted and orange chats using those systems quite readily and in fact preferring those systems. And this is a photo of a white-fronted chat with some nesting material that it's about to use to create a nest in an old man saltbush planting.
Beautiful.
So as I outlined earlier, we looked at a range of different indicators, including plants, and we didn't separate native from exotic in these assessments. And as you'll see, the remnant vegetation had a higher amount of plant species, both native and exotic, than both the saltbush and the pasture systems. And there was a big difference. So the shaded bars indicate spring surveys, and the open bars represent autumn surveys. And the main finding there is that there's higher biodiversity, higher plant species richness rather, in the remnant systems, as we might expect, than in the saltbush and pasture. And not too much difference between the saltbush and pasture systems, except in spring, where there was a significant difference between the saltbush and pasture treatments. Thinking about birds now, we also assessed across those 3 different treatments, and it was fairly evident that there was higher bird diversity in the remnant systems, but also, and importantly, significantly higher bird diversity or bird species richness within the saltbush compared with pasture systems. So as you'd expect, perhaps with the elevated structure that's been provided by the saltbush and the shrub cover, that's actually enticed a whole bunch of different bird species to start to use those systems. And this is where we start to talk about the biodiversity values of these areas. This interesting point here is what actually is a good measure of biodiversity. I've presented some information there about bird and plant species richness, but that is only one part of the story when it comes to biodiversity. The types of different plants and animals is also important to consider. And often in the literature, species richness is regarded as an incomplete surrogate of biodiversity. However, it is still used quite widely as a measure for biodiversity. I mention this because in the context of the emerging biodiversity markets, there will be a requirement to define what biodiversity is and what we might like to measure in terms of the biodiversity benefits from these systems. And so it might be that the metric is purely bird species richness, in which case you can indicate that the biodiversity is higher in those systems. However, it may be that it's more a more complete measure of biodiversity in those systems. So that will dictate, you know, the value, I suppose, of these systems in terms of biodiversity. Probably getting a little bit too complicated there, but it's an important point to point.
It's fascinating, though, Stuart. You know, do those more sophisticated metrics of biodiversity value exist yet?
They certainly do, yeah, it really does depend on what you're using the information for. But if a biodiversity market emerges and it's administered through the Commonwealth, for instance, the Commonwealth will require certain things to be measured, and the likelihood is that that'll be more than just plain species richness. And I might sort of mention my next point, which is really around what species are using those systems. And often the Commonwealth, for instance, will focus on things such as rare and threatened species. So they have a list of species that sit under their Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And often their investment is targeted towards that act. So if you can demonstrate that what you're doing is having a benefit to those species, then perhaps there's a credit associated with that benefit. What we found was that some threatened species do actually use these systems. And bear in mind that this is a snapshot in time. We're out there at certain times of the year and for a relatively short period. So we undertook 20-minute 2-hectare surveys in these sites, and we did 3 repeat surveys at each of the sites. So really we spent maximum of an hour or 2 on site at each of these sites. And in that very short time, we actually discovered a whole bunch of different species using those sites, including things like elegant parrots, hooded robins, and restless flycatchers. And they are included in a list of declining woodland birds across southeastern Australia. And so it's not unknown for these threatened species to use the resources provided by these perennial plantings. And the question there is, where do introduced species fit in? This is an interesting question in novel systems such as this. Some introduced species actually provide some benefit within these systems in terms of erosion control or even resources for native biota. Some species are able to utilise introduced plant species and make the most of the resources afforded by those species. So there's an interesting question there about where do introduced plant and animal species fit in. And this is, I'll now just revert back to the discussion that I was raising around invertebrates, which is whether or not the saltbush plantings are actually providing harbour for beneficial insects, or whether or not, in fact, they're providing harbour for pest species associated with agriculture. And this is something that we started to look into, and we had some entomologists look at the invertebrate assemblage that we caught with those sticky traps that I mentioned earlier. But really we couldn't, just because invertebrate diversity is so interesting and complicated, we couldn't really pull out any meaningful information from the data we collected without going back out and resampling those sites. So that really brings to a close the information that I have about the research that I undertook out in the South Australian Murray Mallee. Nick, have you got any questions at all about those aspects?
Well, I do thank you for a fantastic presentation. I think one of the new aspects, you know, this work's been done before, and you've probably presented this work before, but what has shifted a little bit is the context where farmers are increasingly under pressure. You know, it's not happening yet, but in the future, they may be able to derive some benefit by demonstrating that their actions are improving biodiversity in an agricultural landscape. And it's so fascinating to think that forage shrubs, you know, could provide one pathway to improving biodiversity in an agricultural landscape.
Absolutely, and I think the role of these forage shrubs in providing that matrix habitat that can supplement the existing remnant vegetation in a landscape is a really important point. And one of the researchers who followed up on the work that we did looked at these forage shrubs in a little bit more detail, and he pulled out a number of different species that were using these systems and spent countless hours out in the middle of saltbush plantings looking at the behavior of these species. And he focused on the three species that you can see in this slide: chestnut crown babbler, variegated fairy wren, and white-browed babbler, and really tried to establish why it was that they were using those systems and how often they use those systems, and whether or not they moved across the landscape into other parts of the system, such as remnant vegetation. And what he found was that they do provide significant resources for a range of native bird species, but often that was in conjunction with the remnant vegetation in the landscape. And so paired together, these systems can be really valuable for those particular bird species.
Hey, one of the drivers for our project is demonstrating the production value of diverse shrub species rather than just a pure saltbush planting. I would assume that the biodiversity benefits of a diverse shrub planting would be greater than of a saltbush planting.
Absolutely, we didn't test that, but general ecological theory will tell you that if you have a higher diversity of structural elements and also resources within a system, so if you had 3 species of saltbush, for instance, that provided different resources for native species or bird species, that you would expect to have a higher diversity within those systems.
Yeah, that's very encouraging. On the negative aspects of biodiversity in our landscapes, I've been driving around people's forage plantings a bit lately, and we do see rabbits emerging from saltbush plantings from time to time. So I suppose that's biodiversity that we don't want, Stuart.
Indeed, I think that's that is one of the common gripes. I think it's fair to say with a lot of the farmers that I worked with at the time, that they saw the benefits, and particularly in drought times, these systems were seen to be particularly beneficial. However, they do provide that structure for pests, and it just I suppose adds that element of management complexity, and needs to be considered when considering establishing these systems.
And just finally, I know you've touched on the potential for biodiversity or carbon credits to arise from these kinds of plantings. It's probably too early to comment too much on biodiversity crediting and what that might look like in future. But Yeah, how optimistic are you that biodiversity or carbon markets could be a driver for these kinds of plantings in future?
I mean, I think that if you can demonstrate that there is a benefit from these systems over and above conventional management. So a lot of crediting is around something called additionality. If you can show that these plantings are providing additionality in the landscape, which in many cases they are, they're providing a carbon benefit through the sequestration of carbon into the woody structure of the saltbush plants. And I've demonstrated today that there can be a quantifiable biodiversity benefit. Then there's no reason why they couldn't be included in that type of scheme. As I've mentioned, it will depend on the metric used to calculate biodiversity, but certainly my view is that there is a benefit and that can likely be quantified. So therefore, there's no reason why it wouldn't be able to be claimed in a market that's developing around those aspects of the landscape.
Yes, thank you for referring to additionality. Just for people listening out there, you can only ever hope to be credited with new sequestration or biodiversity benefits if the project is new. There's never any crediting for previous work, is there?
Generally not. There were some concessions made early in the carbon market around plantings that occurred within a time frame from the commencement of the market. But typically it's about what happens in the future rather than what's happened in the past. So it may be that you know, an existing saltbush planting may not be able to be included in a credit market, but it just depends on the rules of the market.
Yeah, and according to current rules, vegetation has to achieve something like 20% canopy closure and 2 metres in height in order to be eligible for a carbon credit. And it's only the unmanaged old man saltbush that ever achieves that kind of height, isn't it? So by and large, carbon would be less relevant to our discussion today, I would have thought.
If the rules of the carbon market remain, then probably yes.
All right, well, we'll probably leave it there, Stuart. Thank you so much for a very informative and thought-provoking talk. And I just find it fascinating that this biodiversity aspect could be another driver for getting more forage shrubs out into our landscape. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Nick.